The Pope sat alone in his private chapel. A single lamp burned on the desk beside him. In his hands, a letter, his own words written hours earlier, begging them to stop. He already knew they wouldn't listen, and what was about to happen in a Swiss meadow would tear the Catholic Church apart in a way it hadn't experienced in nearly 4 decades. 6 bishops, all excommunicated, and the man in the white classic could do nothing but watch. It started with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that builds pressure behind closed doors until something cracks. And in the final days of June 2026, the Vatican was full of that silence. Thick, electric, suffocating. Pope Leo XIV, Robert Francis Prevost, had been on the throne of St. Peter for barely 13 months. He had taken office on May 8, 2025, just weeks after the death of Pope Francis on April 21st. The transition had been swift, the conclave decisive. The cardinals had chosen a reformer, an Augustinian friar who had spent years in Peru, a man who spoke Spanish and English with equal ease, a man who believed the church could change without losing its soul. But now that soul was being tested. His advisors had told him, Cardinal Fernandez had told him, everyone around him had told him the same thing. The Society of St. Pius X would not back down. They had announced it 5 months earlier in February with the cold precision of a military operation. 4 new bishops would be consecrated on July 1st. No papal mandate, no permission, no apology. The announcement had landed like a bomb on February 2nd. A communique from the SSPX leadership issued without warning, stating that episcopal consecrations would take place on the 1st of July. The reason given was clinical, an objective state of grave necessity. The Society's 2 remaining bishops, Alonso de Galera and Bernard Fleet, were aging. 2 others had died. Tessier de Mahler in 2024. Williamson was expelled from the Society years earlier in 2025. Without new bishops, the SSPX could not ordain new priests. Without new priests, the entire movement, 700 clergy, 600,000 faithful seminaries and chapels on every continent, would slowly wither. So, they made their announcement, and the Vatican scrambled to respond. Now, with the date less than a week away, Rome was running out of options. But what happened next? What Leo chose to do in those final hours would define not just his papacy, but the future of Catholic unity itself. Before we continue with this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the atmosphere had changed. Staff members noticed it first. The usual rhythm of meetings, briefings, and prayer had been replaced by something more urgent. Phones rang constantly. Secure lines buzzed between Rome and the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Messengers moved between offices carrying sealed folders. Leo had spent the week before the crisis at Castel Gandolfo, the papal summer residence outside Rome. It was supposed to be a period of rest. It became a war room. On June 16th, standing outside the residence, a journalist asked him directly, would he intervene? Would he make a final appeal to the SSPX? Leo paused, his eyes narrowed. Then he said something that surprised everyone. If they make that choice, I am sorry, but we must move forward. That single sentence sent shockwaves through the Catholic world. It was not a threat. It was not anger. It was a resignation. The quiet, devastating kind that comes when a father realizes his son has already made up his mind. But Leo was not done, not even close. Behind the scenes, a different battle was being waged. One the public didn't see, one that involved late-night phone calls, handwritten notes, and a level of diplomatic maneuvering not seen in the Vatican since the Cold War. Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, had been the Pope's point man on the SSPX crisis since February. He had met face-to-face with Father Davide Paglarani, the superior general of the Society at the Palace of the Holy Office on February 12th. The meeting was described as cordial. It was anything but. Fernandez had come prepared with a proposal, not a vague gesture, a real structured theological dialogue. A path with what the Vatican called a well-defined methodology. They would sit down together and work through the issues that had divided them for decades, the teachings of Vatican II, the question of religious liberty, the Church's relationship with other faiths. At the end, there would be a clear canonical status for the Society, a real place within the Church, legal recognition, legitimacy, but it came with one condition, one non-negotiable demand: suspend the consecrations. Paglani listened. He was polite, measured. He even thanked the Cardinal for his time. The dicastery described the meeting as cordial and sincere. Both men knew the truth was more complicated than that. Paglarani took the proposal back to his council. The answer came on February 18th. No, not maybe. Not let us think about it. No, the Society's reasoning was devastating in its clarity. Paglarani explained that serious disputes of doctrine remained between the SPX and the Church. And since only the Church can pronounce authoritatively on such matters, and since the SSPX believed the Church itself to be in error, no real progress was possible. The dialogue would be dead before it started. In the shared recognition that we cannot find agreement on doctrine, Paglarani wrote, "It seems to me that the only point on which we can agree is that of charity toward souls and toward the Church." It was the most polite way anyone had ever said, "We think you're wrong about everything and we're doing this anyway." That rejection set the clock ticking. From February to June, the Vatican tried everything: diplomatic channels, back-channel conversations, intermediaries, former allies of the Society who still had personal connections to its leadership. Cardinal Fernandez issued a formal warning on May 13th, stating plainly that the consecrations would constitute a schismatic act and result in automatic excommunication. Nothing worked. And then came the open letter. On June 24th, just 3 days before an extraordinary consistory of the College of Cardinals convened by Pope Leo, the SSPX released a bombshell, an open letter addressed directly to the Pope and every cardinal in the world. Attached to it was a 154-point document they called a profession of Catholic faith. It was not a peace offering. It was a declaration of war. The letter accused the Church, the institution they claimed to love, of being led astray by the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. It rejected ecumenism. It rejected interreligious dialogue. It rejected the very idea that non-Christian religions might reflect any ray of divine truth. And it stated without apology that the authorities of the Church had been animated by a spirit contrary to the faith. The profession of faith was 28 pages long, 154 carefully enumerated points, each one a rejection of something the modern Church had affirmed. It was signed by Paglarani, by File, and by several other leaders of the movement. It was not a dialogue. It was a verdict issued by the accused against the judge. The SSPX said they hoped the document could one day serve as the basis for an honest discussion with the Holy See. But the timing said everything. They released it the day before the cardinals gathered. It was a challenge, a dare. Look at what we believe now. Tell us we're wrong. When that letter landed on desks across Rome, the reaction was immediate. Cardinals who had spent months urging patience now called for action. The mood inside the extraordinary consistory held June 26th and 27th shifted from dialogue to damage control. The consistory itself was unprecedented. Pope Leo had convened the full College of Cardinals for what was supposed to be a broad discussion of church governance. Instead, the SSPX crisis consumed the room. Cardinal Gard Miller, the former prefect of the Doctrine Office, stood before the assembled cardinals and made a proposal that stunned the room. Create a special commission not to punish the SSPX, but to help those lay people and clerics inside the society who wanted to come back, who wanted to return to full communion, who were being held hostage by the radicalism of their own leadership. It was a surgical move, separate the faithful from the extremists, and it signaled something the Vatican had been reluctant to admit. The SSPX leadership was no longer interested in reconciliation. They never had been, but Leo still wasn't ready to give up. On the evening of June 29th, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, one of the most sacred days on the Catholic calendar, the Pope did something extraordinary. He sat down and wrote a letter, not through intermediaries, not through the diplomatic machinery of the Holy See. He wrote it himself. The letter was addressed to Father Paglarani, but through him it spoke to every bishop, priest, seminarian, and faithful member of the Society of St. Pius that contained 3 words that would echo across the Catholic world. Please turn back. The Vatican published the letter the next morning, June 30th, and when the world read it, something shifted because this was not a papal decree. It was not a legal document. It was not a threat wrapped in ecclesiastical language. It was a letter from a father to his children, and it was heartbreaking. The full text was devastating in its simplicity. Leo acknowledged the Society's devotion to liturgical life. He praised their commitment to priestly formation. He recognized their apostolic zeal. He even noted that 2 bishops assigned by the Vatican years earlier to dialogue with the SSPX community had recognized their profoundly Catholic spirit and bore public witness to it. He wasn't dismissing them. He wasn't attacking them. He was pleading with them. He was telling them, I see you. I see what you love. I see why you're doing this. And I'm asking you, not ordering you, asking you to stop. I urge you to consider carefully the spiritual good of the faithful, he wrote, because the schismatic act you are about to undertake would deprive them of the listenate, and in some cases even valid reception of the sacraments. He was telling them, if you do this, your own people suffer, the families who trust you, the children who receive their first communion in your chapels, the old women who kneel at your altars every Sunday. You will be cutting them off from the church they love. And then came the line that carried the full weight of 2,000 years of papal authority. I pray for you because to tear the seamless garment of Christ is a sin of extreme gravity. May the Lord enlighten your consciences and awaken your hearts. The letter was signed, sealed, and sent less than 24 hours before the consecrations were scheduled to begin. And then the world held its breath, waiting for a response from Icon, hoping somehow that the Pope's words had reached them, that something, anything, had changed. But what arrived back from Icon was not what anyone had hoped for. Father Paglarani responded that same afternoon. His letter was respectful in tone, almost gentle. He thanked the Pope for his fatherly concern. He expressed sadness at not being understood, and then he confirmed that nothing had changed. The consecrations would proceed as planned. Marc-André Miadard, the Society's media manager, was even more direct when journalists called him. His voice was steady, almost serene. He said they felt great sadness at not being understood by their leader, but then he added something that revealed the depth of their conviction. We don't fear excommunication. It pains us immensely. But we believe that the good we seek is greater than the pain that will be inflicted upon us. That night in Rome, the Vatican went quiet. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. The machinery of canon law was already in motion. The warning had been given. The law was clear. Canon 1382. Anyone who consecrates a bishop without a papal mandate, and anyone who receives such a consecration incurs automatic excommunication, not a trial, not a hearing, not a debate. Automatic. 6 men were about to walk off a cliff, and they knew exactly what was at the bottom. Meanwhile, 1,200 kilometers to the north in a valley in the Swiss Alps, the preparations had been underway for weeks. A corner, a tiny village near Rides in the canton of Valais, is not on any tourist map. There is no train station, no hotel, just a narrow road winding between vineyards and mountain pastures that leads to the International Seminary of St. Pius. But in the days before July 1st, Econ was transformed into something between a pilgrimage site and a military staging ground. Workers erected a massive white tent over the altar area because the seminary's church, the Church of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, was far too small for what they had planned. Giant screens were positioned across the meadow, sound systems were tested and retested, camera crews from around the world arrived, setting up equipment for what would become a 6-language global live stream, watched by tens of thousands online. The SSPX had created a dedicated website for the event. They had opened a Telegram channel. They had hired organizers and security and media coordinators. The SSPX had even launched a dedicated website for the event. They were selling commemorative wine, a special box called Cuvée de Sac, 75 Swiss francs per set, featuring 4 bottles of local wine, each one decorated with the image of one of the 4 men about to become bishops. This was not a reluctant act of necessity. This was a celebration, and the symbolism was deliberate. AON was the same location where Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, the founder of the SPX, had caused the first great rupture in 1988 by consecrating 4 bishops without papal permission. That act had resulted in excommunication, later lifted by Pope Benedict XVI in 2009. Now, 38 years later, the society was doing it again, in the same meadow with the same defiance. Even the vestments were the same. The robes worn by the new bishops were the ones used in the 1988 ceremony. The throne placed at the center of the altar was Lefebvre's own chair. Every detail was designed to send a message. We are not backing down. We never back down, and we never will. July 1st, 2026. The morning broke clear and warm over Eorn. The Swiss Alps rose in the distance, snow-capped and silent, indifferent to what was about to happen below. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the meadow was already filling. Families arrived early, carrying folding chairs and blankets. Many wore traditional attire, women in long skirts and veils, men in dark suits. Children ran between the rows, clutching white caps printed with the words Orn 2026 handed out at the entrance. The crowd would eventually swell to 17,000 adults. According to organizers, they came from nearly 70 countries: France, the United States, Germany, Brazil, Australia, the Philippines. An entire global network of traditionalist Catholics gathered in a Swiss field waiting for an act that would sever them from Rome. At 9 o'clock sharp, the procession began. First came the religious orders linked to the SPX, nuns in full habit, brothers in brown robes, seminarians in black cassocks, then the priests, hundreds of them walking in solemn rows, and finally the bishops. Bishop Alonso de Galarreta of Spain, the principal consecrator. Bishop Bernard Flay of Switzerland, the co-consecrator. Both men had been here before. Both had been consecrated by Lefebvre himself in 1988. Both had been excommunicated and later pardoned. Now they were about to do the very thing that had gotten them excommunicated in the first place. Behind them walked the 4 men who were about to receive episcopal ordination without the Pope's blessing. Father Pascal Schreiber from Switzerland, 53 years old. Father Michael Goldade from the United States, 46, originally from North Dakota. Father Michel Pouansderi from France, 42. Father Mark Hanapier from France, 36, the youngest of the group. They walked in silence. The crowd stood as they passed. Some crossed themselves, some wept. The ceremony itself was conducted entirely in Latin. De Galera stood with his back to the congregation, whispering the ancient liturgical formulas into a microphone. The rite was technically valid, the prayers were correct, the laying on of hands followed proper form. But it was missing the one thing that made it legitimate in the eyes of the Catholic Church, the papal mandate. At the moment in the liturgy when the mandate would normally be read aloud, the moment when the Pope's written permission authorizes the creation of a new bishop, an assisting priest stepped forward and read something else entirely, a justification. From the Second Vatican Council to the present day, the priest declared, "The authorities of the Church have been animated by a spirit that is contrary to that of the faith and have been acting against holy tradition." In that single statement, the SPX did more than ordain 4 bishops. They rejected the authority of the Pope. They rejected the reforms of Vatican II. They rejected 60 years of Catholic teaching, and they did it in front of 17,000 witnesses and a global live stream audience watching in 6 languages. Father Paglarani then delivered a homily that lasted more than 30 minutes. He spoke in French, his voice steady and deliberate. He called the Pope's appeal a false dilemma, a forced choice between faith and church that he refused to accept. No one can choose between faith and the church, he said. We want the faith of the church in order to remain in the church, and we want the church within the faith, even if those opposed to us refuse to understand this. He also called for the canonization of Archbishop Lev, the man who had died in 1991 without ever reconciling with Rome, without public signs of repentance, a necessary condition for full reconciliation that Lefebvre never fulfilled. The request was more than symbolic. It was a provocation, a statement that in the eyes of the SSPX, the man Rome had excommunicated was actually a saint. He went further. He accused the church's leaders of humiliating the Pope by placing him alongside false shepherds and representatives of false religions. He was referring to ecumenical gatherings, moments of interreligious dialogue that popes had championed for decades. In one sentence, he dismissed the life's work of 3 pontificates, and then he urged the newly consecrated bishops to be vigilant, to resist the slow slide toward modernity. Your worst enemies will not attack you head-on, he warned them, but will try to make you slide gradually toward a more updated perception of the faith. When you sense this danger, reflect, pray, seek counsel, remain still before reacting like a serpent. It was a warning to stay radical, stay pure, stay separate. And then something happened that no one had planned. As the ceremony reached its central moment, the actual consecration of the 4 bishops, the sky above Yorn changed. Clouds that had gathered slowly through the morning suddenly darkened. The temperature dropped. A warning flashed across the giant screens positioned throughout the meadow. Beware of imminent thunderstorm. Seconds later, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour crashed onto the crowd. Thunder roared. Lightning cracked across the alpine sky. The 17,000 faithful, most of them standing in the open air without shelter, scrambled for cover. Rain ponchos appeared, some in the yellow and white colors of the Vatican flag. Umbrellas snapped open, mud churned underfoot. But the ceremony did not stop. Inside the white tent, de Galarreta continued the rite. The 4 candidates knelt before him, drenched in more than rain. They recited their oath in Latin, pledging fidelity to the Catholic Church, to the Pope, and to his legitimate successors. And then, in a paradox that observers noted with grim irony, they also pledged to fight against schismatic heretics. The rain lasted 20 minutes. Then, almost as suddenly as it had arrived, it stopped. The sun broke through the clouds. The meadow steamed in the warmth, and the ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. One by one, the 4 men received their mitres and pastoral staffs. One by one, they became bishops in the eyes of the SSPX at least. In the eyes of Rome, they became something else entirely. Excommunicated all 6 of them. De Jeda fel Schreiber Goddard Puans de Chivi Hanapier. The moment the consecrations were completed, canon law activated automatically. No decree was needed, no papal pronouncement. The act itself carried the penalty. 6 men walked into that meadow as members of the Catholic Church. 6 men walked out as something else. After the ceremony ended, 5 hours after it began, the newly consecrated bishops walked among the crowd, extending their gloved hands for the kneeling faithful to kiss their episcopal rings. Then they processed uphill to the seminary courtyard, where they were met with applause by SSPX priests. Their final act of the day was to descend into the crypt of the seminary church and stand before the tomb of Marcel Lev. Together all of them, the old bishops and the new ones, the priests and the seminarians, sang the Salva, a hymn to the Virgin Mary, sung by men who had justified her son's vicar on earth. After the Salvina faded, the new bishops turned to the Galere, the man who had consecrated them, and wished him et multos annos, may you live for many years. It was the traditional greeting given to a bishop by those he has just ordained, a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of filial devotion. But outside in the real world, those words carried a different weight, because the Galera had just ensured that however many years he had left, he would spend them excommunicated again. The SPX released a statement shortly after. It expressed what it called sincere regret that the consecrations had to be conferred without the authorization of the Holy Father, but the regret was performative. The statement immediately pivoted to celebration. The gift of 4 new bishops, it said, constituted a very great grace for the society itself and for the whole church. Meanwhile, in Rome, a very different kind of silence had settled. Not the dangerous kind this time, the exhausted kind, the kind that comes after a fight you knew you were going to lose. Pope Leo XIV had watched the live stream from the Apostolic Palace. His aides confirmed this later, though they refused to describe his reaction in any detail. What they did say was that the Pope had spent the morning in prayer, that he had celebrated Mass privately in his chapel before the ceremony even began, that he had spoken with Cardinal Fernandez by phone twice, once before the consecration started and once after they were completed. Sources close to the Vatican said that Fernandez himself, watching the ceremony unfold on a screen in his office at the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, had been visibly shaken. Not by surprise, he had known this was coming, but by the scale of it, the 17,000 people, the 6 languages, the commemorative wine, the fact that this was not a desperate act of rebellion, but a choreographed spectacle designed to make schism look like celebration. The Vatican's official response was still being prepared, but the world already knew what it would say. The consecrations were illicit, the excommunications were automatic, and the door that had been held open for decades through 2 popes, through lifted sanctions, through granted faculties for confessions and marriages, that door was now closing. Fernandez, speaking to journalists after the ceremony, left one door slightly ajar. He did not rule out future dialogue entirely, but the terms had changed. The SSPX would now be approaching any future conversation not as an irregular community seeking reconciliation, but as an excommunicated group seeking readmission. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Cardinal Blas Kitch of Chicago, one of Leo's closest allies, put it bluntly. The real danger, he said, was not the consecrations themselves. It was the creation of a parallel structure within the body of the church, a shadow church with its own bishops, its own seminaries, its own authority, answering to no one but itself. And that was exactly what the SSPX had built. 600,000 members worldwide, 700 priests, seminaries on every continent, chapels in dozens of countries, a complete ecclesiastical infrastructure operating entirely outside the jurisdiction of Rome. The consecrations didn't create that that structure. They guaranteed its survival for the next generation, and that was the part that stung the most. Not the defiance, not the theology, the strategy. The SSPX hadn't acted out of impulse. They had planned this for years. Their two remaining bishops, Deg Galera and File, were aging. Bishop Teixier de Mahler had died in 2024. Bishop Williamson, expelled from the society, had died in 2025. Without new bishops, the SSPX couldn't ordain new priests. Without new priests, the movement dies. So they made their choice not between faith and obedience, between survival and communion, and they chose survival. Father Paglani had tried to explain it in his homily. He spoke of a state of grave necessity. He argued that the church itself was in crisis, that its leaders had abandoned tradition, that someone had to preserve the old faith, the true faith, even if it meant breaking the rules. It was the same argument Lefebvre had used in 1988, word for word, and it had been rejected then too. But something was different this time, fundamentally different. In 1988, the consecrations shocked the Catholic world. They were seen as an act of rebellion, a last desperate gamble by a dying archbishop who feared his movement would die with him. Pope John Paul II responded within 48 hours. The excommunication decree was swift and absolute. The act was declared schismatic. Lefebvre died 3 years later, unreconciled, buried in the crypt at Econ, but then something unexpected happened. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI lifted the excommunications of the 4 bishops Lefebvre had consecrated. It was an olive branch, a sign that Rome wanted reconciliation. Pope Francis went even further, granting SSPX priests the faculty to hear confessions in 2015 and allowing bishops to authorize them to witness marriages in 2017. Those concessions were extraordinary. They gave the SSPX a kind of semi-legitimate status within the church, not fully recognized, not fully canonical, but tolerated, accepted, given room to exist. And the SSPX took all of it. The faculties, the tolerance, the patience, they took everything Rome offered. And then they consecrated 4 more bishops without permission. This time the world wasn't shocked. It was exhausted. The SSPX had telegraphed every move for 5 months. They had rejected every offer. They had issued ultimatums. They had published open letters and professions of faith and press releases. They had sold commemorative wine. The consecrations weren't a surprise. They were a spectacle. And that was perhaps the cruelest part. The Vatican had done everything it could. Leo had offered dialogue. Fernandez had offered a theological path forward. The Pope had written a personal letter, handwritten, intimate from the heart, begging them to reconsider, and they had read it, acknowledged it, and said no. In the days that followed, the implications began to ripple outward. The faculties that Pope Francis had granted to SSPX priests the ability to hear confessions and witness marriages that were recognized by Rome now hung in the balance. If the Vatican formally declared schism, those concessions would almost certainly be revoked. Hundreds of thousands of SSPX faithful would find themselves cut off from the sacraments they cherished, not because of anything they had done, because of what 6 men did in a field in Switzerland. Inside the Vatican, conversations turned to what comes next. Some cardinals pushed for an immediate formal declaration of schism, mirroring John Paul II's swift response in 1988. Others urged caution, arguing that a harsh reaction would only push moderate SSPX members further away. Cardinal Muller's proposal, a commission to welcome back those who wanted to return, gained traction as a middle path. But the underlying question remained, what do you do when someone doesn't want to come home? Leo had answered that question on June 16th, standing in the sun at Castel Gandolfo. 4 words that now carried the weight of prophecy. We must move forward. The church would move forward. It always had. Through schisms and heresies, through wars and reformations, through scandals and betrayals, the institution had endured for 2 millennia. One more rupture, however painful, would not destroy it, but it would leave a scar. Pope Leo XV knew that better than anyone. He had spent his entire priesthood working within institutions, as an Augustinian friar, as a bishop in Peru, as the prefect of the dicastery for bishops. He understood how organizations fracture, how trust erodes, how a single act of defiance left unanswered becomes an invitation for others to follow. And he also understood something else. Something he had not said publicly, but that everyone close to him recognized. He was grieving. Not for the institution, not for the canon law, not for the diplomatic failure. He was grieving for the people, for the families who had packed into that Swiss meadow believing they were defending the faith, for the children who had stood in the rain watching men in golden vestments tell them that the Pope was wrong, for the old men and women who had given their entire spiritual lives to the SSPX, trusting that their leaders knew best. Those people were not schismatics. They were believers who had been led to the edge of a cliff by leaders who told them the fall was actually flight. And there was one more thing, one detail that most people missed in the flood of coverage. During the consecration ceremony, when the 4 candidates knelt before de Galarreta to receive their ordination, they were asked to take an oath. Part of that oath, an ancient formula spoken in Latin, included a pledge to fight against schismatic heretics. They swore to fight schismatics while committing schism in the same breath. The irony was so deep it felt almost literary, but this wasn't fiction. This was real. And it was happening inside a church of 1.4 billion people watched by the world, live streamed in 6 languages, commemorated in bottles of Swiss wine. That night, Leo returned to his private chapel. The same lamp, the same desk, but this time no letter in his hands. Just silence and a weight that no prayer could fully lift. He had done everything he could. He had offered mercy when others demanded punishment. He had offered dialogue when others called for condemnation. He had written a letter with his own hand from his own heart, asking them, pleading with them to reconsider. He had called it a sin of extreme gravity. He had asked the Virgin Mary to intercede, and they had read every word, and they had said no. In the hours after the ceremony, reports filtered into the Vatican from around the world. SPX chapels in France held vigils of thanksgiving. In the United States, parishes affiliated with the society rang their bells. Online forums erupted with celebration. For the faithful of the SSPX, July 1st was not a day of rupture. It was a day of triumph. But in the decease of the Catholic Church, in the offices of bishops who oversaw territories where SPX chapels operated, the mood was very different. If the Vatican declared schism, the faculties granted by Pope Francis would be revoked. SPX priests would lose the ability to hear valid confessions. Marriages witnessed by SSPX clergy would no longer be recognized by Rome. The sacramental life of hundreds of thousands of people would be thrown into uncertainty, not because of anything those people had done, because of what 6 men chose to do in a meadow. In the crypt at Ion, 6 excommunicated bishops stood before the tomb of a dead archbishop and sang hymns in Latin. Above them, 17,000 faithful were already heading home, carrying folding chairs and white caps and bottles of commemorative wine. Some drove through the night toward France. Others caught flights to distant countries. Many of them didn't fully understand what had just happened. They knew they had witnessed something historic. They didn't know yet what it would cost them. And in Rome, the Pope closed his eyes and prayed, not for victory, not for vindication, not even for justice, for healing, for the church he had been chosen to lead, for the people who didn't know yet that they had just been torn from it. For the 6 men who believed with absolute sincerity that they were saving Catholicism by breaking it apart. He had written 3 words to them, please turn back. 3 words that carried the weight of 2,000 years of papal authority. 3 words that meant nothing to the men who heard them and everything to the man who wrote them. The seamless garment of Christ had been torn again, and nobody on either side felt anything like joy. This story is still unfolding. If you want to stay updated on what happens next between the Vatican and the SSPX, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Do you think Pope Leo handled this the right way? We read every single one.